Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Byline TV's first ever live broadcast here from our studios, not in Burbank, but in Bankside. I'm Peter Jukes, I am not Andrew Neil, and I am the co-founder of Byline Times, Byline Festival, and I am joined tonight for our first ever live broadcast by the editor of Byline Times, Hardy Matharu.
Hello.
So it's been a tough few days, weeks, months, almost a year with the coronavirus. But here's a little ray of light, and that's our brand new studio. Thanks to you guys for your support, for supporting us on Patreon, Patreon.com/Byline TV. We're able to build a better studio and hopefully inform you about what's really going on, because though she looks a bit like my Susanna Reid, and she's going to raise an eyebrow now rather than roll her eyes, we think there is a crying need for informative and good TV, particularly, Hardy, don't you think, since the news about GB News and Fox News coming to the UK?
Absolutely. These sort of even darker forces are on their way, and what we saw in America, the storming of the Capitol, and this whole sort of conspiracy theory that Donald Trump has been able to propagate around, stop the steal, that has been sort of all over right-wing media news channels in the US, and sort of that is infiltrating what's happening here more. So, it's really exciting to be here because Byline TV is something that's desperately needed. And we know that from the work we've done on Byline Times. There's a crying need for independent, fearless reporting and investigation. So we're really excited, aren't we, to bring that to the TV.
Yeah, I mean, particularly you can reach a wider audience. And you're right, I mean, if you look at our recent coverage, we've done a lot of coverage of what happened in America, the insurrection that happened, that is promulgated. It's a form of terrorism. It's promulgated by Fox News and also all these alternative news sites which are popping up everywhere. And in the UK, but let's have a review of the last year very briefly. We'll talk about the year ahead and our plans for Byline TV. But looking back at last year, the interesting thing is two things happened, I expect, I surmise. One is that actually the rise of alternative media is mainly right-wing. I mean, if you look at the live TV shows, not people who documentaries like Double Down or whatever, they are things like, obviously, GB News, Unlocked, Reasoned, the Farage show. This is all occupied by kind of right-wing pundits, wouldn't you agree? And you've seen, we did one of our first Byline TV reports of how that impacted on UK politics with the scandemic movement. Do you remember that last year?
Oh, I do remember it. I remember it well. Kate Sharamani called me a special snowflake because I questioned her comparisons of the coronavirus pandemic to Auschwitz and the Holocaust.
Remind us who Kate Sharamani is.
She's one of the figureheads, really, of the scamdemic movement. And I had quite an in-depth conversation with her about all her views around why lockdown isn't required and how it's all there just to control us. That was one of Byline TV's early reports. And again, we need to be countering this disinformation around a public health emergency, but also it has its roots elsewhere. We all remember what happened during the Brexit debate. And what's really interesting, I thought, was the new BBC chairman has been appointed. And he gave an interview, I think, yesterday, and he was saying that he felt that BBC Question Time actually had too many Remainers on their panels rather than Leavers during the referendum campaign. But he thought that it had generally done a good job in a quite toxic environment. It's interesting to note, I guess, that he has donated money to the Conservative Party, and other sort of links have emerged, other affiliations. But it's just yet another example, isn't it, of how the media landscape in this country has been skewed and is becoming increasingly that way when, the challenges that we're facing politically or socially or, on a global health scale, they're sort of rising. And yet, where is the counter to that?
Well, the problem is, I think, you mentioned this idea that you should balance too many Leavers or too many Remainers on Question Time. That shouldn't be the BBC's job. That shouldn't be the job as us, as journalists, just balancing opinion. I mean, that's what they did, didn't they? Obviously, with climate change denial, the Today programme got into deep trouble because there's like 3% of scientists who think the man-made global warming isn't happening. and they balance that against the 97% who think it is, and have one-on-one. We've seen that also with Toby Young appearing on television, talking about...
Very recently
He's on
Newsnight.
Who is this guy? He knows nothing. He's not a virologist, he's not a serologist, not an epidemiologist.
But he runs a website called Lockdown Skeptics. It's a blog, yeah.
It's a blog. He runs a blog. He's a well-known right-wing figure who's always deleting his tweets. And yet he's brought on as expert. And you don't balance truth, do you? I mean, Patrick Howes, who writes about this for Byline Times, a former BBC producer, is very good at it. But there's not a balance between a lie and a truth, a falsehood, and what's actually happening.
And actually it's also about being rooted in reality, isn't it? I think what's interesting, what's happening in America, is a lot of sort of Donald Trump supporters who are interested in QAnon and these conspiracy theories about the election. There is this, this detachment from reality, and how you tackle that and try to counter it is very difficult. I also think another thing, if we're talking about the BBC, is this notion of just going onto the street and getting opinions. Let's 3 people of one opinion, 3 people of the other. But where is the sort of quest to investigate and actually look at what the facts are, and different approaches we can take to things based on that, rather than just what people feel. Often when we're interviewing people on the streets, how people feel.
Or what they've already seen, a feedback mechanism on media. So that's that classic line, shall we debate whether it's raining? Go out and see. But sampling other people's opinions who've maybe watched your TV shows, who worried, if Channel 4 famously after Brexit, why did you vote to leave the EU? Because of all the immigrants here. Mainly we're not EU.
Yeah.
And the problem with these lies, they are big lies, they will just circulate, won't they? Because if most American right-wing media says Trump, the big steal, Biden stole the election, there was a lot of fraud, what happens when they confront reality? What happens except violence,
Well, precisely, and this is why we're launching Byline TV now, isn't it? Because we do need to stop these lies, And when we had an interesting discussion earlier, didn't we, about sort of what's happening in the UK at the moment. And I mean, there's incompetence and scandals on a grand scale with the Boris Johnson government. And we were, I was sort of going into the almost cultural, psychological, philosophical reasons behind sort of a British psyche that still buys in and sort of, kind of bows down, doffs its cap to the ruling classes, and exceptionism, and a few other things that we'll come on to soon. But you made an interesting point that yes, it could be that. It could be cultural reasons, embedded in our kind of institutions and our politics and the way we are. But you said, but do people actually know what's going on? Is it that they want to doff their cap, or do they not know what's happening? And certainly with Byline Times and Byline TV, that's what we're trying to offer, isn't it? What's actually happening? What are the scandals? What is herd immunity? Where joining the dots between these things.
Well, the 2 things happened in the last year, and we've only set up Byline TV 3 months ago, and already got this great studio. It was obviously a terrible pandemic of communicable disease. It's not like cancer or heart disease, but people make comparison. More people die of cancer, but you don't wander down the street and catch cancer off or heart disease or obesity of somebody else. But also an infodemic and of a disease form of communications. And that's one of the most shocking things, I think, for me, and why I've come to this late in my life, in the autumn of my years, unlike you in the spring of your years, is there's a crying need for information. And that's why, after this discussion, you can join us on Patreon for your questions and more interaction. We do need to fund this, so that's the way you help and build us, make documentaries, do shows like this, do profiles, do debates, is by funding us on Patreon at a very low cost. Okay, so you talked a little bit about sort of some of the scandals we've covered last year. Partly, Byline Times has been leading the way with maybe 40 stories on this dodgy PPE, personal protective equipment particularly, which was bid without contract, £17 billion worth because of the pandemic, no competition without going to tender. Surprising number of these contracts going to donors to the Conservative Party. Surprising number not actually delivering. And we were banging on that for about 6 months, weren't we? Before the National Audit Office took it up. And then the New York Times and everybody else followed it. Because we like to be on the ground floor of these things. But what would you say, that, and there's been others now about vaccinations, about school meals, outsourcing, and laptops and things like that. What do you say this scandal tells us about the state of Britain under the Vote Leave government of Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, on one level, it's just, I think, incompetence and sort of acting on the hoof during an emergency for which the government is not prepared or failed to prepare. And is sort of just firefighting at all costs. So the whole sort of premise of why these PPE contracts were given out to sort of firms with questionable expertise in the area, and some firms only a few months old, was because we really needed to get those PPE stocks up. So the first question is, why do we not have the PPE? Is that impacted by Brexit? Is that impacted by the fact the government did not prioritise planning for a pandemic, as it was warned to a few years ago? So there's one issue of incompetence. I think a deeper sort of structural issue, though, is really what kind of state is the Vote Leave government running? You know, and so we've seen, I mean, the scandal, the great procurement scandal, has been sort of characterised by cronyism. And some people, a lot of our readers, say, well, don't call it cronyism, call it corruption. And that's a really serious point, you know. And I think Timothy Snyder, the historian, Yale professor, who's been, you know, so fantastic during all the events that have happened in America, he calls, you know, what's happened in America and Russia under Putin as sort of this notion of democracies with oligarchical features actually turning into oligarchies with some democratic features. And we need to look at sort of, you know, the extent to which some of that's happening here. You've got a Vote Leave government, you've got their sort of chosen donors and friends and acquaintances, and they seem to be doing quite well out of a public health emergency, which is just, you know, despicable, really.
Well, it's terrifying to me. I mean, 100,000 people have now died in the UK. 40,000 in streets around here in South London died in the Blitz. And yet, during that year where we've been locked in, most people's lives have suffered. Most people have been lonely. People have suffered loss of income. That some people have enriched themselves on the public purse, on our money, at that expense. And I think that you're right. It speaks in any other country, we'd call that, you know, be rude to banana republic school that. We don't have banana, you know, it's actually worse than that. And it's this kidding ourselves. You're always writing about this English exceptionalism, that we are better than everybody else, and the sense that Boris Johnson can tell jokes in Latin, so therefore it must be okay because our educated classes just don't do those things. So has that shocked you, and does that connect to the other big issue, I think, of last year, which again, a lot of stuff on Byline Times, which is often forgotten, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. In the middle of this pandemic, globally, from the death of one guy in America, George Floyd, that the whole, you know, black and white people came together throughout Western Europe and America to protest this. Is that something else you feel that hasn't been properly covered in the mainstream press?
I mean, I think that has been a real turning point in terms of the last year, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the discussions that it prompted in this country in particular about our imperial past. I definitely think that the subject of empire, as we've spoken about many times, Peter, generally isn't something that you discuss in society in this country.
You raised it once, didn't you, at a public event about Leveson, and there was this embarrassed silence, like you'd dropped a glass or something.
All I said, when I was asked about what the problems with media, and I said we've lost context with 24/7 news. We're always talking about Brexit, but we never talk about empire. And I see the two things sort of as actually quite structurally linked. But yes, I do think in this country it is a complete taboo not to talk about our colonial exploits. And the repercussions it has on what's happening today in terms of structural racism and inequality that persists in this country. So definitely last year sort of ignited that conversation in a way I think is really positive. I still think that there are lots of different nuanced angles to that. I don't think it's as simple as just to talk about sort of statues or museums. A lot of the mainstream press have reported on these things. But it's more the unconscious influence of colonialism, on empire, on the insidiousness of sort of how those things play out in what we see with our governance, with people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson in power. So I think it is really about looking at sort of the nuanced sort of bits. And I've been very open in my work in that my parents were immigrants from India and Kenya. They both voted to leave in the EU referendum. And I've explored sort of why that is, and actually why that is to do with unconscious forces of empire. And I think it's about understanding these issues more.
Yeah, it's a love-hate relationship, isn't there, with many sort of former Commonwealth immigrants. They feel like your parents feel aggrieved about Amritsar, the massacre there 100 years ago. British generals shot how many hundreds of Sikhs, Indians in that square. But they also don't feel any affiliation to Europe. So there's this weird love-hate. Well,
they feel very British.
Very British. You owe us, guys. And we notice this other communities. But what's shocking to me is like the lack of coverage of this. I mean, if you look at the big stories last year, we might have some screenshots of them. It's things like Guido Fawkes complaining about XR and an ambulance getting in the way, or Julia Hartley Brewer, who I'm not sure if she's deleted her tweets, maybe she should, saying that COVID wasn't a danger, we don't need lockdown, there won't be any second wave, or Boris as Santa in the sun, where a massive issue like that, like the structural racism that people of colour face every day, and also the unconscious privilege, people like me, even though I'm Armenian, Welsh, London, I'm still English effectively, is that I did grow up thinking, oh, look at the map, it's all pink. I remember thinking at the age of 6, oh, I'm lucky I've been born in one of the biggest empires in the world. Though it's declined, but my mother, born in 1926, it was the biggest empire in the world. And it's like, well, the front page of our current edition, isn't it, of Byline Times is Boris Johnson falling off the White Cliffs of Dover.
Yes.
But with the shadow of Churchill behind him.
Yeah, the shadow self of empire.
Of empire.
Haunting Britain.
And also this image of the war, that the White Cliffs of Dover, we stood alone against Europe, as we've been against Europe during Napoleon, as we've been against Europe, the Spanish Armada, as we've been against Europe in the Norman invasion, but we lost that one. And also in the Romans.
And one of the things I think is interesting about taking, like you said, these big developments, sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, structural racism, a public health emergency in the form of the coronavirus, and seeing what these big issues are degenerating into because of what's happening in the mainstream media, and also, like you said, alternative media. So the coronavirus crisis, it's beyond dispute that it's happening. But what is going on? It's kind of degenerating into lots of discussions about lockdown skepticism. Can we trust the vaccine? Other shadowy plans afoot. So that's happening. And then when we look at sort of structural racism highlighted by the death of George Floyd, but also our unconfronted imperial past here, that is degenerating into a culture war, which the government seems to be very willing to not only push, but amplify and benefit from. And it's this divide and rule with that, which is very dangerous. We've seen that so many times in the past, this divide and rule, create difference, create othering. But it's just interesting to me how in both of these areas, it's sort of, but we're getting lost in these other debates, which are sort of
it's like bread and circuses. It's bright, glistening thing. What's Lawrence Fox doing now? What's Katie Hopkins doing now? This politainment, which distracts us from those cultural issues and seems sexier, though they go away. They're like froth. These issues are always going. They don't change anything, don't tell you anything. And I think that's really important about this divide and rule. Because if we're looking ahead, which we'll now do, and before we look ahead, I think I ought to say thank you again for supporting and joining us, and that if you want to continue this discussion when we finish in about 20 minutes' time, we're ready for your questions on Patreon, patreon.com/Byline TV, where with a small amount of money, cup of coffee a month, you can support us and make sure we keep on going, not just hearing myself and Hardeep talking, but amazing documentaries, investigations, some debate as well, but telling you things as they are and not telling you what to think. But going back to divide and rule, we've got to look ahead now to the next year. This year's just begun. And I'm minded to think exactly what you said of what's happened in America, because we've done a lot of work on that. And we have several American correspondents. Now, one of the things we imported from America, thanks to especially the Vote Leave government and their connections with American lobbyists and American dark money, is what they in America call the Southern strategy. This came up, Nixon came with it because, the Democratic vote was heavily in the South, but, they were against civil rights. He co-opted the old Democrat vote in the South by basically saying, you're economically Democrats, you want, you want more good wages, good social support, Medicare, but we're going to get you to vote for very rich Republicans and for tax cuts and for the very rich by culture wars, by saying they're going for your guns. There's people of color coming down the street to get you. They're not religious, they're liberals, they're Jews, all this culture wars, which had a racist base, made people whose economic interest was to vote Democrat, to vote Republican. Do you think that's what kind of happened here, especially last year with the Red Wall and sort of Boris Johnson, the Etonian man of the people?
Yes, I do. I honestly do. I think divide and rule is sort of at the heart of the neo-imperial project of Boris Johnson's government. And we've had a few Byline Times writers point this out, that actually we're going back to some sort of notion of an imperial state, Empire 2.0, but without the empire. But yeah, I think there is this sort of, as I said, creating difference and creating others. I think most prominently came out during the Brexit debate. So obviously there was scapegoating. Here are the others that are coming in and ruining things. But it's also the othering within communities in Britain, right? So it's suddenly people now frame themselves as I voted to leave and I'm a Remainer. And that already is sort of, it's interesting because it makes us think about our identity in a way that we probably wouldn't have previously. We've just people who've lived side by side now feel different from each other, and we're going to see more of this play out with the Union. What's going to happen to Great Britain? What's going to happen with Scottish independence? If suddenly someone said tomorrow, we're going to have, Scottish independence is going to happen, and there's going to be a wall be built between Scotland and England. How is that going to make people in England feel? How is that going to make us feel? How does that impact on how we see our identity? And I think, so divide and rule is something that's here to stay. Within the Union, it's going to play out. It will much more so culturally and socially in terms of race and structural issues like that. But we're also seeing it with regards to, political issues that you would imagine that it shouldn't be applied to, like the coronavirus crisis, and creating this sort of, I think it was, Nafeez Ahmed reported on it for Byline Times that three people went to see Boris Johnson before he made a decision to delay a lockdown.
The great Barrington, including Gupta and the Swedish head of health, Tindall, and the Swedish model was held up as this great model thanks to a lot of lobbying and a lot of media pressure, when of course now we know that Sweden, it was disastrous. And Boris Johnson, against the advice of SAGE, against the suggestion of Keir Starmer, didn't lock down, and now we...
But again, that's a division, isn't it? It's one camp versus another camp. So
Divide and rule is a very good way of, and it's describing it. It's amazing that the BBC chairman should categorise question time in whether you'll leave or remain. That's like whether you're a Cavalier or Roundhead. Incredibly divisive. I think also the other thing, we think about the Red Wall, that there's all these people like Claire Fox going on, Baroness Claire Fox, about metropolitan liberals, like they're the voice of the working class. So you get this brilliant class divide and rule. The prolier than now, from very middle class people live in North London. We're in South London, of course, where it's slightly warmer and it's much more flamenco and much funkier. And on that note, we don't consider ourselves a London paper, do we? We consider ourselves a local paper for kind of the world. And we're not that London-centric because most of our writers aren't based in London and we don't follow Westminster. But yes, this time last year, we were very much looking at the future of the Union, got slightly delayed, went to Dublin and Belfast and looked at how they feared English exceptionalism. Lockdown stopped us going to Scotland and following the idea. But Cameron did that. He basically divide and rule. If you can peel away the Scottish votes away from Labour, you get a Conservative majority in England. But you're not thinking about the Union. He wasn't thinking about Northern Ireland when he put that border in the sea. He's not really thinking about fishermen when they played the fisherman game to get Brexit. And so that's your feeling as well, isn't it? We're going to see more of that conflict. In a way, the rump empire, which is the United Kingdom, it's going to have its own problems.
Yeah, and there's been some brilliant sort of work done by Fintan O'Toole, Anthony Barnett and others saying that Brexit is part of a much wider journey for the UK. And the UK is a mini empire in itself, ruled over by Westminster. And actually, the Brexit vote in some ways was looking at the cracks and divisions between the union, its precarious union.
Some good news, though, because it sounds a bit dark, is that Biden did win. Now, people might not think Biden's left-wing enough, or might think he's still a neoliberal or captured by corporations, but it's not Donald Trump, and that has got to be an improvement.
I remember how relieved you were, Peter. I remember how relieved you sounded when I spoke to you about the election result coming through. And you did say to me quite seriously, didn't you, that you felt it was like one of the biggest political moments that you've lived through.
Yes, I'm now 60. I'm joined here by my co-founder Stephen in the shadows. He's actually slightly older, at least 3 months older than me. No, actually probably 6. He may remember worse things. I vaguely remember Kennedy being shot. In fact, I remember thinking he'd been shot by the Lone Ranger. And my mum, and I don't know, it's many years later, the Lone Ranger was a TV character with a black bandana. And I have this picture of Lee Harvey Oswald with a black in my head, with a black bandana and a black hat. And they called him the lone gunman at the time, so I must have confused them. And that was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I went through Thatcherism, end of the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, all fairly positive things, really. There was progress. I did have a strong sense that it would be a catastrophe for us and our country particularly, but for the world if Donald Trump got in another time. And the direct effect is on us. We call ourselves a rump Trumpocracy. We've been following the connections between Brexit and Trump, the money and elements of Russian influence and Putin's oligarchs. If Trump had got away with that, we'd have no chance of pushing back here against that kind of covert dark money. It's not about Russians, it's about hedge funds and dark money offshore interfering in our politics. So I am much more optimistic that we'll get the bad guys here now.
Yeah.
And Byline TV will be here whenever that happens. Now, that's enough of the serious stuff. Now we're going to dance. No, you've got to roll your eyes like Suzanne. I'm going to be Piers Morgan for a moment. You can't roll your eyes, can you? You can raise an eyebrow. Oh, you can?
I can, Peter.
Okay. This isn't going to happen regularly. So what have we done in this last week? I mean, they built this amazing studio. I wonder if we can look around. Can people see? Amazing lighting. How would you describe it, Hardeep? It's sort of, is it GB News with a conscience? Is it Good Morning Britain, but at night time?
I don't know, I think the word open sort of springs to mind.
Open?
It's really open, really...
Warming,
sort of,
generous, honest.
Yeah, warm and open, I think.
Well, he's in the shadows. Steve, how would you describe it?
Well, I think it's the first time we're actually going to get to a TV station that actually tells the truth, but also we feel part of it.
Okay, so what he said, if you can't get it back, is you're supposed to feel part of it. You paid for it, so come along and join us in the party. It wasn't that expensive at all, but this is very much down to George and Kaylin, who are also in the shadows, who have amazing design sense, and I think it is important to have a nice environment where people can talk. It's relaxed. The other place was very small, wasn't it? And very kind of in your face. Also, what's wrong with being a little bit stylish? You can be progressive, you can think about other people, and also have fun at the same time.
Well, I'm all in favour of that, Peter.
I did actually a thing with, very interesting, actually 2 things today. One is I did a conference with Trevor Phillips, and he did make this point just on Black Lives Matter. He was judging the RTS Awards, 100 awards, like 100 segments he had to look at. Only 5 were on Black Lives Matter, and he thought that's extraordinary. That's the biggest story of last year, and the British media won't cover it. And I did another with Double Down News, who do a brilliant job covering sort of hard political issues and on the street. And they're very good at that face to face, and they're kind of, asking questions and it being sort of like an essay. But we need space to get out to meet people in the street, ordinary people. Like our team has done already a brilliant couple of documentaries with Minel Viz, this doctor who was first to protest because of PPE, just had a baby during the pandemic, about the oyster man of West Mersey, one of these fishermen who's going to be completely screwed by Brexit. So hopefully we'll do more outside investigation. But this particular week, what else have we done? Built the studio. We had a couple of stories about education. We broke the story. Well, Roadside Mum, other people got it, talked to us. And I think Sam, our, political and investigations chief reporter, came in and assessed what that contents of Roadside's Mum, her free school meal package for the week, wasn't it? Rather than the voucher, because the ministers thought ordinary people would spend the vouchers on drugs or something crazy, they decided to send them meal for a week. And Sam got it out and looked at it and bought it at the local shop, bought it for £7.
Yeah, there's a whole table here full of
£7.
Foods that
but
look nice and
if you
nutritious.
for £30, I don't know what happened. What happened to all that food, guys?
Food bank.
You went to the food bank, good. So I didn't know that. I'm not just being so political, showing how good we are. What a scandal. And our story wasn't it, that the company that got the contract had sort of done other things in the past. Why are people worried about working class or ordinary people or school who can't afford to pay for their kids' school meals? They're worried about they'll do the money, but they're not worried about the outsourcers and these companies, what they're doing. That just says something about who the government trusts and distrusts, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also how we got to a stage where a fantastic footballer is the only check and balance, I would say, on our political system right now in terms of holding the government to account. I think he's just so inspirational. You go on Marcus Rashford's Twitter feed and you see so many comments by people who are like, wow, you really lifted my spirits today. How have we got to a stage where a national footballer has to force Boris Johnson to do a U-turn, mainly because Johnson, who knows the value and power of celebrity, because he is a celebrity politician, that was his genesis, essentially, he fears a PR disaster. And so he has a call with Marcus Rashford, who is a very committed campaigner on social justice issues, and then he agrees. I mean, we've had this new thing today or yesterday about the February half term. Again, schools don't have to provide free meals for kids. So again, Marcus Rashford has been on social media, has been, having meetings, and it's that we have to ask ourselves, how have we got to that state where he's the only person who has a platform and a voice who can affect change, as well as people such as, Jack Monroe. There's something really wrong there, but it's always really inspiring to see people like Rashford really using their voice to give a voice to the voiceless, which is what we hope to do at Byline TV and Byline Times as well. And I think you're right, Peter. I think we need to sort of also be a bit positive about what's going on in this country and the coronavirus pandemic. And it's shown so much how there is real community spirit. People really want to look out for each other. I think in part because they know the government's not going to do that. And something has really changed in the social fabric of Britain. I think that notion of, the state and looking after those in need, I think it's radically shifted. But I think people are aware of that and they're stepping in. Should they have to? That's another question. But I think there's a real spirit, and that's another thing I know Byline TV wants to do. They want to get out and see those organisations, talk to those people who are trying to redress some of these issues, and stand up and make an impact in any way that they can. I think that's sorely missed. You never turn on the TV and hear about sort of, what's happening on a constructive level with, people are sort of being innovative and kind and supportive. We need some of that too, because fundamentally it's about fresh ideas. Where do we go forward and how? And for that, we need people to come together and think about these things.
Wait, one of the things we did for the new year was 9 reasons to be hopeful, wasn't it?
To stay hopeful.
Stay hopeful. And one of those was community spirit and self-organisation, self-help, not, in the way that people working together. We actually see it's more efficient when it comes to things like test and trace, a local authority doing it. And I always say that everything that's wrong being proved by Brexit and Johnson was already wrong before they came along. We now know how wrong they are, and it's up to us to fix it. And that's one of the things, as I said, in the autumn of my life, along with Stephen, we want to fix is access to media, both the truthfulness of it, but also getting in people, talking to genuine people, not cutting them up, not sampling them because they happen to go to university with Boris Johnson, as Toby Young did, because they're backed by the Spectator, because they've genuinely got real experience and something to say. And we'll be going out and doing lots of documentaries that way. So before we kind of wrap up a bit, and we'll take questions on our Patreon channel for you exclusive ones who fork out £3 a month. I mean, thank you. But before we do that, let's just run a couple of clips. Let's have a look just to see that, the stylishness and what Kaylin and George and the team have done. Our cool new trailer. We ready for that, guys?
Yeah.
And we're rolling. So that's just a sample of some of the stuff we did last year. We'll be doing even more this year, especially with this amazing space. And we've got sort of reports coming up. We've got Mike Galsworthy coming in talking about science. We've got these amazing films with John Sweeney, a whole host of things. And with this space, it won't just be me, myself, and Hardeep. We'll have all kinds of interesting guests, all kinds of interesting discussions late into the night. Both on the sense of the investigations we do on Byline Times, but also, getting people in to say what they really think, to explore issues in a non-adversarial, I would say, in my posh way, an inquisitorial way, what's actually happening. And you can tell us if we're doing well or if we're not. We, at Byline Times, we take all kinds of citizens, journalists, stories, they come to us. And so we're always happy to hear from you, which we will soon be doing in the sequence on Patreon for you who have questions and answers. So everybody else, thanks for listening. Not quite going yet. We have just an example of what we quickly turned around before the studio was built. Our report with Sam Bright, our investigations and politics reporter, on the school meal scandal.
Over the past couple of days, lots of photos have emerged on social media of parents receiving free school meal packages. One woman posted a picture on social media. She'd been promised £30 worth of food by the government. She was actually delivered this, so 5 slices of cheese, a can of beans. We went to the shop and bought this, and it turned out to be roughly £7 worth of food. So the government was trying to persuade this parent that this was £30 worth of food. So we went back to the supermarket to figure out how much £30 could actually get you. So instead of 5 slices of cheese, you can get a block of cheese as big as my head. You can get loads of ham. Instead of 1 tomato, a whole bunch of them. Lovely bread, in fact 2 loaves. Bag of apples. Instead of
we're not run by, we're run by you. I'll use the line I used in the trial. I've got my jacket. Be back. Oh, see, that's my perfect timing. I'm getting used to it, but I'm not Andrew Neil. That's the good news. So I was genuine and I said, we're not funded by advertisers. We're not funded by oligarchs. We're funded by you. So we want to get to know you more, hear your issues. And one way of doing that is going in 10 minutes time to our Patreon link. And that's at patreon.com/Byline TV. You can give us questions. We'll answer as many as we can. If they're dodgy, we can be a small number. We can be a bit more informative than we can online, especially if you want to know legally challenging things. But we are genuine about we want to listen to you, respond to you, and broadcast for you. So hope to see you in 10 minutes. And Hardeep, do you want to say goodbye?
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you in 10.